Hi, everyone. Thanks. That title, I just apologies to some of you who've seen some of my work before. I'm going to be presenting some things that have been kind of around for a decade, but this is an interdisciplinary audience, many of whom have not seen some of these things. So I'm going to kind of cover some old ground. Oh boy. We start off and the first slide is missing some stuff. Hold on a minute. Okay. It looks like the good stuff is there. Okay. I'm not sure what happened when we sent the seminar slides. What you can't see on this figure is I wanted to start with a big picture. And the big picture, if you could see it, would be one of long-term fertility decline in the United States, interrupted by a 20-year 50% increase in fertility rates that occurred during the baby boom. You can see this isn't about World War II. I call this the World War II wiggle. So this is you see a little bit of that. You see a little bit of World War I. You also see a little bit of Vietnam. You know what? I'm worried that yeah, and you see that the general fertility rate and also, I don't know what happened with my slides. These things are supposed to be overlaid so that they're exactly the same. This is the total fertility rate here. And this is the general fertility rate that should be shifted back over here. And one of the things you can tell is the two of those move in sync if they were on the same scale. And again, I have no idea what happened with my slides. And if I figure it out, it will take a long time.
Is it on a USB maybe? Did you copy it into the?
No, I sent it by email, but by the time we figure this out, there's another version. So you guys are just we'll see some other slides later. But one of the things you can see there's a story of long-term fertility decline. I'm going to ask you to just focus on this line here. This is the total fertility rate. The general fertility rate, which is the number of births measured per women of childbearing age, was the long-term decline, and that's what we can measure for the longest time. But you might also want to account for changes in age structure, which can also influence the fertility rate, which is what the total fertility rate does. And it divides through, just so that we're all on the same page, the number of births in a particular age group. These are typically measured in 5-year age categories over the population in the same age group and multiplies by 5. That's because they're in 5-year age group. And the way to think about the total fertility rate is that the number of babies that would be born to a woman if she experienced the age-specific fertility rates at a point in time. And to be clear, this is not about the experience of any given woman, because I'm living out my, as I'm living out my childbearing years, I'm doing that sort of in chronological time, not at a particular moment. So as we have changes in fertility rates that happen over time, you can see big swings in the total fertility rate, which often will reflect delays, but don't necessarily show up in completed fertility. Now, the total fertility rate is one that everyone pays attention to because it also has a very natural interpretation. And so this is the number of children that the average woman would have to have, that would have over her lifetime if she experienced the point in time age-specific fertility rates. In the United States, reached 1.6 in 2024, which is not only the lowest number ever recorded, but it's also well below what's considered replacement of 2.1. It also makes us look much closer to countries like the UK and France than sort of this outlier. We had kind of been hovering above sort of replacement, unlike a lot of European countries for a long time. The other thing that I want to say, if you could see this long run decline going back in the general fertility rate, would be there's two periods that demographers often think of, or I will say there's often one demographic transition, and that typically refers to fertility decline that largely happened in the post-bellum period in the United States when the US is kind of going through sort of a big industrial transformation. There's some question about whether or not there's in fact been a second demographic transition, which happened as the baby boom was declining. And if you're looking at the big picture here, one of the things that you might be surprised about, see if I can get to a better one. One of the things that I think is not necessarily the case is that you see this long-term decline interrupted by this 20-year big increase, but you might not think that this is that different than anything we've seen in the past. In fact, we think that the birth rates would have continued to go down, right? Sort of we have this anomalous period of increase, but they would have continued to go down after the baby boom ended. And if you stare a little bit more closely over here, one of the things you might think is it's not surprising that we've ended up at 1.6. The more surprising part might be, in fact, that it took us some time to kind of get there, right? So why did it take so long? So, I mean, now I've got to go back to some other slides. So a couple of things I want to do in this talk. The first is I want to spend some time talking about this concept of a second demographic transition. Is there a there? Is anything we've seen recently very different than what we would have expected, given this longer term decline that you couldn't see, but I promise you was also there? Or is this just a continuation of what's been going on for over 160 years? My own view is that yes, I think there are some new things afoot. Whether or not this is large enough to be called a transition, which I think are fighting words for demographers, is something that we can have an active discussion about. But I do think that there's some important new features here. I want to talk also a little bit about the role for modern contraception and abortion in this transition, but for brevity, I'm going to omit a lot of the evidence around that, but that's something we can talk about too. That's kind of the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk is I want to kind of dive into the more recent decline in fertility rates that have happened since the Great Recession. And I'm very interested in understanding how far below replacement fertility are we really? And what is the future of US fertility? And that will be a little bit more speculative. So yeah, go ahead, Tom.
So my rough understanding is that in demographer speak, second demographic transition often refers to changes in family structure, marriage, and so on that are associated with like current population trends. Is that what you're going to be talking about too? Or?
Give me a couple slides. We're going to define it too. Okay, so what is the case for the second demographic transition? I want to start by just saying this is based on some work I did with Brad Hirschfein and Melanie Gouldy about a decade ago. And so they're very important collaborators, and what you'll see today will update those slides. So what is the second demographic transition? And I think credit for this term can be given to Ron Mustaga and Klaus van der Kok, who in 1986 made an argument saying that all sorts of things changed in the 1960s and 70s, owing in part to modern contraception and sort of the rise of second wave feminism and changes in women's rights. They argued low fertility rates had arrived, increased childlessness, delayed marriage and childbearing, increases in non-marital cohabitation and childbearing, high divorce rates, and then later they added this piece about women's labor force participation. But to be clear, there are, oh my gosh, this is terrible. There are all sorts of critiques of this particular point of view. Again, we're just going to ignore this part in the middle. A number of these trends already existed before the 1960s. And so in most of the European member states, in fact, most of them emerged with the demographic transition in Europe, which happened later than in the United States around the turn of the 20th century. Others have claimed that if you just cut off any graph, right, at the height of the baby boom, it looks like the entire world has changed. When in fact, you know, this is just, the baby boom is an aberration of demographic history. So I'm going to zoom in on this period, and hopefully my slides will cooperate here. And I'm going to do a couple of things to try to zoom in and get underneath what these macroeconomic trends are, sort of these period birth rates, and talk a little bit about some other things that have been going on underlying the surface that are, I think, are much less well known. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot from period birth rates, which largely come from vital statistics or registers and don't have a lot of information on other individual characteristics, to something we can get from the US Census, which is completed childbearing. And what this comes from is a variety of censuses that ask all women who have ever been married historically and then after 1970, all women, how many children, how many live births they have ever had. So this will include births that end in infant and child mortality, for example. This is the number of live births they've ever had. And what we do to look at completed childbearing is we limit the sample to women who are ages 40 and older, up to age 70. You can do some age adjustment. There's all sorts of other things under the hood that I'm not going to talk at length about. And you can do this then by cohort. So what I've done here is I've looked, so this is the height of the baby boom, which is right around 1960. And this corresponds to women who were born in about 1935, having a very high, above 3, average number of children. So when you look retrospectively, and then you align the series, and you can do this different ways, 27, 25, it doesn't really matter too much, you get exactly the same picture as the period fertility rates give you in terms of completed childbearing. You have declines in completed childbearing, this 20-year very large increase in completed childbearing, and then a rapid drop-off. The other thing you can see is that these are both plotted over here. You can plot out completed childbearing, which hasn't fallen as quickly as the TFR in some period because part of this decline reflects delay and is also, I'm going to argue, completed childbearing is going to remain much higher than in fact you might expect, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So let's start with the big picture history then. What does the underlying histogram look like? So you can think about this as sort of a frequency distribution moving through that first demographic transition period. So here I'm plotting the number of children ever born, and here I'm plotting the percent with a certain number. If you look at women who are born around 1850, which is coming of age right after the Civil War, one of the things you can see is that the distribution, I will say, for ever married women is almost uniform, right? You're only slightly more likely to have one child than you are, right? 9. So you can see this is very flat. So there's a whole lot of variance here in this outcome. And this notch here is driven largely by women who don't marry, right? So for ever married women, so this is very, as we move through that first fertility decline into the 20th century, one of the things you see is this compression of the tail over here. And the cohorts of 1910 in the United States are called the low fertility cohorts. There's a couple of things that are important about them. About 75% of all women and 2/3 of ever married women had 2 or few children. This is way before the modern era, modern contraception, abortion, etc. About 30% of them were childless, which I think is also something that most people do not know. If you move through the baby boom, you see again the cohorts shift out, right? You have a lot more children born, childlessness rates really fall. And if you move back, sort of what happens, these cohorts are roughly the ones giving birth to the baby boom. What happens for that second fertility decline? And there we have a sharp fall, again, this compression in the tail, but unlike the cohorts for the early 20th century, we have much lower rates of childlessness for these more recent ones. You see this big compression about 2. So this kind of evolution, we see this big compression, a reduction in variance. I call this, a 2-child norm or a 2-child mode, whatever you want to call it. Okay. A few important points. So just comparing these cohorts to the cohorts of 1910, those are the statistics I just told you before. The cohort of 1960, you have roughly 70% of all women achieve 2 or fewer children, and roughly half of that number, exactly 2. That's very different than the other distribution. About 20% were childless versus 30% for that earlier period. And the other thing, I'll just ask a poll. What happened since? And if you've seen my talk before, don't give it away. What do you think has happened since the 1960 cohort, birth cohort? How have things changed in the next 25 years as we've seen completed fertility fall? I'll let you just make a mental picture. I won't make anyone raise their hand. One of the things you might think is because we've seen the TFR fall so quickly that we have seen, right, more compression again, right? This entire distribution shifting back. Oh, it's going to kill me today. But in fact, we haven't. Up to the most recent cohorts we can measure, those distributions are almost on top of each other. And we do know that sort of the women who are in the 80s, they are not quite as old. So we're missing some of their childbearing that's happened in the 40s. You see that those distributions are very close. And I will say this is drawing on fertility surveys. So there's some sampling noise here too. So we don't have a lot of confidence that these are different. But it just gives you the sense is that not a lot has changed for the cohorts that have completed their childbearing, that is up to 2024. Now, where does that leave us for the first point of the second demographic transition argument? One is that I've shown you, we do see lower fertility rates today than we've seen in the past, but I will say I've put a big asterisk next to that one. Maybe not quite as low if you look at completed fertility. And then the second piece is increased rates of childlessness, which is also false. That is actually not something that's unique to the modern period, contrary to what a lot of people think. Let's go on to the next. So let me summarize. So one of the things that I think is exceptional in the post-1960 period in the United States, that is basically dating to those cohorts born in 1940 or after, is the emergence of this 2-child norm, right? We have that mode that showed up. We have a big reduction in variance relative to the historical low fertility rates. That's new. Reductions in, All the slides are, I don't know what happened here. Another thing that you can look at is age at first birth over time. And if you could see this, it would show you that the median age at first birth in the United States has been kind of heading along like this. We've seen a little bit of notch for these early fertility cohorts. So it rose slightly for those cohorts. It falls pretty dramatically during the baby boom, along with every statistic you can measure. Everything moves in a pronatalist direction, and we see a recovery. So if you look then at the beginning, the low fertility cohorts versus the cohorts today, one of the things that you can see is that we're very, very close to exactly where we were if you rewound 70 years.
Martha, can I ask you
Yes.
a question? So this stops in 1980, and I totally understand why you're doing that, because you wanted to look at people who completed
Mhm.
fertility. But for this like age of post-flow, you know, would it still?
It keeps on going, yep, it's, yep. I'll show you a little bit more on that. The other thing you can see is this distribution also changes. So here's the baby boom. There's a lot of compression back. People start having children a lot earlier. But you see the cohorts of 1910 and 1955. Those are, you see 55 is a little bit further. You lose some of the mass here at those early years, but the two of them are not terribly different. So the other thing I'll say is that this idea that we've seen overall, on average, delay in childbearing does not seem to be dramatically different today than it was in the past. I'm going to keep going. Oh my goodness, everything's missing. I've given this talk several times and I don't know what happened to my slide, you guys, I'm really sorry. Another important thing, they were talking about increases in women's labor force participation. And if you're familiar with the macro trends, you know that there's a big break around 1940. We have this sort of change around World War II, and then they really continue to go up, sort of plateauing around the 1990s, right around 60%. But underlying that broader change, I think, are two distinct periods of shifts in women's labor force participation. The first, and what I'm plotting here, let me just orient you. This is the age of the cohort here. So this is a woman's labor force participation, say, in her early 20s. And you can see that as she moves through her life, how much she's working for pay in the formal sector. So for women, early in the 20th century, born around 1900, you can see that they had fairly high rates of labor force participation, over 40% at these younger ages. What you can't see, because these are every decade, is that there's a big dip that happens after marriage. Labor force participation rates fall rapidly, they remain low, and then there's a little bit of re-entry later in life. Between 1940 and 1960, increases in women's labor force participation rates are really driven by upward changes in the re-entry of older married women. So this is like the empty nest phenomena. Those are dramatic changes in their labor force participation rates. But starting with those cohorts in 1940, remember, those are the women who are coming of age in the 60s and 70s, where we've seen those other structural breaks. The big changes are for them in their younger ages. You have this large increase. This is almost 20, a little bit over 20 points, almost 30 points for some of these in a 15-year period for women's labor force participation. And since then, we've seen the plateauing in women's labor force participation because not a lot has changed after that. So then we start to plateau in the 1990s. So what I'm not showing you here, but what I will tell you is going on in the background, is that increased women's labor force participation rates, this is not novel to the more recent period, but one of the things that is increases in mothers' labor force participation rates, especially those with young children. That is something that is very, very different in the more recent period, and something that is consistent with them increasing here. They are timing childbearing and career together to make very different decisions about exit. Okay. So the rise of working younger mothers, younger women, and especially mothers is novel. Another thing that let me see what I can get from this slide here. Oh, goodness. Another thing that you can't see, but I want to assert that this is true. If you track changes in age at first birth with median age at first marriage, you can see that they're 1.5 years, 2 years apart. So pretty much the story historically was you would get married, get pregnant fairly quickly with your first child. So that was what was going on in this period. And these two track each other fairly closely. During the baby boom, we see a fall. And you also have the share ever married or cohabiting kind of ticking along, and it's slightly lower as you go back. Basically, a straight line. Around 90% of women have ever married or cohabited as you move through all of these cohorts. But one of the things that breaks down in the more recent period is we see this sharp rise in the age at first marriage. But part of that phenomenon is really driven by the fact that younger people no longer get married formally. They simply cohabit. So when you take that into account in modern surveys, you can see we're only slightly higher than historical rates of sort of partnership and even long-term cohabiting partnership in these stories. What this does mean, though. Yeah.
I'm just trying to, at the end of that graph, the top.
Yeah, oh yeah, so
What's going on?
little staggers, it was gonna roll out and be beautiful. But here's what's going on. This is the share that have been married
Okay.
by this
I see,
age.
okay.
Plummets. And once you account for changes in cohabitation, you in fact see that we're right up there. So this reflects the fact that, so this isn't this, so part of this is a selection story. If you look at age at first marriage, it's going up, but we're missing a lot of those earlier marriages that are being replaced by cohabitation. And you can argue about, marriage and long-term cohabitation are very different things, but you can see that if you just look at this partnership and cohabiting relationships, we look very similar to what we were in the past.
Martha, is this ever married or ever cohabitating, or is it ever married and currently cohabitating?
Ever married and ever cohabiting.
Okay,
So increases in non-marital cohabitation and are important because one of the things that's being driven there, and this is actually a statistic that's very, very different depending on what country you look at, is the rise in non-marital first childbirth. So that's something that you can very much see here because you've seen, especially starting sort of in the 50s in the United States, that's increased a lot. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. So this one is one of the ones that Van de Kaw and Listhaga brought up that I think in fact does have a lot of merit. This is something that's quite new. I'm going to leave off divorce in the interest of time. So feature number 3, this decoupling of marriage and motherhood, I think has a lot of merit. This last part I want to do is go through and say, how does this break apart by class? For example, what's the difference between the most educated and the least educated, or the higher income and lower income? And one of the challenges of doing something like this is that you actually need something that is fairly stable over the life cycle, because remember, we're using retrospective information. You don't get it on vital records or registry data in most countries, and definitely not in the United States. We also need it for people who are not working, mostly women, especially historically. So what we did in the United States, and I need you to remember that the United States is a very educated country at the turn of the century, so this actually works fairly well. We have a lot of variation in educational outcomes. I've recently discovered this is not the case in many other European countries, so it makes it much harder to do. So it's well measured. We're going to use years of education, which becomes available in the 1940 census, even for non-working women. It's fairly stable over their life cycle, though there is some educational creep. It's correlated with both women's own background in terms of where they're from. It's also correlated with their spouse's characteristics, because many people meet in school, of course. And it's also comparable across longer periods of time. What I don't want to do is compare people with a middle school education or a high school education or a college education over the 20th century, because those groups have changed fundamentally over time. So instead, we're just going to look at the upper, the top quarter and the lowest quarter, and document how these outcomes have changed for both of those groups. And this is what this looks like for some of the things that I've been showing you. So one is completed childbearing by cohort. There's a couple of things I want you to see. This is the least educated quartile. This is the most educated quartile. And this is the mean that before I was overlaying on the total fertility rate. So a few things to note. One, the least educated quartile and also lower income women have always had more children than the more educated or higher income women. So you see this is true. We see this track very well. The baby boom, we have a larger increase for the most educated women. And coming off the baby boom over here, you see this sort of beginning of this compression. And today, the differences between groups are much more similar than they ever have been in the past in terms of the number of children they've ever had. Another thing I want you to stare at here is if you look at the most educated women, here, this most educated quartile, you see that their completed childbearing is way below 2. Even the early 20th century. So this is 2. So they hit that way below for those low fertility cohorts. And you can see they hit it again over here. But the other piece that's interesting is that we've seen, in fact, numbers of children ever born to this group rising over time rather than falling. So that's also, I think, something that is surprising to a lot of people. Let me document how this is related to percent childless. Tom, you want to ask a question? I saw, I
If there's no time for class.
think I have, do I have 20
Yeah,
minutes?
you have a fair amount of time on that.
I have a
No,
lot
I
more
don't.
slides.
So I wanted to like push a little bit on the, like on the sub-replacement fertility in the 1910 cohorts. That, well, I guess they were in their prime childbearing years during the Great Depression. Right?
Mhm.
That seems.
Sort of what's going on, but I mean, even if you look at these earlier women, they were certainly headed there well before the Great Depression happened, which I think is, so you might think that the Great Depression caused this. If that's the case, wouldn't we expect to see some sort of big trend break or something along those lines? And that's not in fact something we see, which so may or may not be dispositive, but I think that something to keep in mind. Go ahead, Adrienne.
Sorry, this question, but I guess I'm wondering how we get this, but for 1870, because the education's available in 1940s.
Correct.
Like a lot of bias in survival.
Yes,
things like
you
that.
worry about that. That's so what I'm not showing you under the hood is so what you can do, you cannot do it for the cohorts of 1870, but for more recent cohorts, you can look to see how much, for example, it would matter if we observed them at age 60 or 70 or 50 or 70. And you can also do some things to age adjust the data. It turns out that I was really surprised about this because I was quite worried myself. It doesn't really make any difference, which I think it tells us something about survival bias, how it's correlated with both parity and sort of historical data. So we can talk more about that if we get into that. I will, but yeah, that's a concern. But it doesn't actually seem to be driving these trends. Something else you can look at, sort of just changes in the percent childless over time, and we see the reverse pattern as we saw with the number of children ever born. For the most educated women, born sort of in the late 19th, early 20th century, they were much more likely, almost a third of them were childless. Many of them would have also been unmarried. And those rates were much lower for the least educated profile. You see the baby boom in the middle of that picture, kind of everything collapses during this moment. And then you see things rebound. It looks like we're headed back to where we were for the most educated, but in fact, that starts to reverse around the cohorts born in 1960s. This may be related to assisted reproductive technology or other types of things that have helped people have children at older ages, and we've fallen back down here too. So you've seen childlessness rates overall increase for the least educated and fall for the most educated, again, resulting in some of the most similar rates that we've ever seen sort of across socioeconomic status in the United States.
Do you have similar data for the UK?
I'm working on it, Andy.
Okay, because I was just thinking like World War One, you could think of it as a natural experiment. We kill off a lot of males.
Yeah.
What does that do to the percentage?
Yeah, I'm actually, what I was going to advertise is that I actually have a very large project right now where we're working with people all over Europe using their register data, census data. This is in fact very, very hard to do because none of the countries will let me access their data unless I'm there. So we're partnered up with all sorts of other people. I'll tell you a little bit about that, but that's part of the next steps of this project. If we look at median age at first birth, in fact, the least educated women, we see this fall during the baby boom, as we would have expected. And one of the things I think that's unexpected is it has recovered much less. We have some issues with US surveys here, so I left it there so you can just interpolate. But you've seen the rise in the age of first the age of first birth really rise most for the most educated quartile here, increasing the gap from what was about 3.5 years to over twice that amount for cohorts born around the early 1980s. And finally, and then this is the one that's very, very different across country. Non-marital childbearing in the United States has been disproportionately concentrated among the least educated. In Europe, this is in fact flipped, and highest among the least educated and very, very low to this day among most educated. One of the implications of a number of these trends is something I just want to point out. So the demography turns out, I think, to be very, very important to thinking about the evolution of human capital. If you look at women's own wage income, so the own wage income of the average mother moving across birth cohorts, starting around the cohorts of 1940, these two things these two numbers, this is about 21,000 versus 8,500. The amount for the most educated women is roughly twice as high. By the end of the 20th century, it's almost 4 times as high. What's gone on there? There's been an increase in earnings inequality, like increase in sort of the returns to skill, but there's also been a large increase in delay in marriage and increase in the likelihood that the women are working themselves. So those two things have also served to amplify things. And if you add in information on their partners, husbands, earnings, you can also see that there's a very, very large increase from about 1.7 to 2.7 times at the end of the 20th century. And so one of the things I think that's going on beneath the hood here is that there's lots of structural changes, some related to the economy, but also related to the sort of evolving demography that influence the ability of people to invest in the next generation. There are a lot more resources for those that happen to be already born to very well-educated parents. And this is not just mothers, but also fathers, because remember, this group also it's much more likely to be married, and falling resources in real terms for some of those in the least educated quartile. So the fourth feature, I think, that's really unique to the modern period is that rather than these things moving in lockstep as they had for most of the history we can observe, we see a widening of these education gaps in the age of motherhood, non-marital childbearing, and then this growing inequality in resources for children, which I think is a really fundamental thing that's going to interact with human capital policy. So just to sum up, these are the 4 features I was talking about. The emergence of the 2-child norm, this reduction in variance, and a reduction in childlessness has been something we've seen over the 20th century. The rise of working younger women and mothers is something that's very unique. Historically, women worked plenty, especially disadvantaged women, but working mothers were much less common than they are today. The decoupling of marriage and motherhood, that is a modern feature. And finally, this widening of the education gaps in the age of motherhood and non-marital childbearing. So to your point, Andy, yeah, go ahead.
You know anything about rural urban?
I do, but I don't have it in this talk, so I can show you afterwards. Yes.
Have you read that?
It goes in exactly the direction you would expect. Rural areas are less educated, lower income, have more children, perhaps for those reasons, but also because there's more workers needed on farms, things like that. So it's not going to add, I think, there's no nuance that's added to kind of the big picture story relative to what you would see here, but I have those numbers and I can show you too. You also can break it down by race. Again, it falls out the same way you would expect. So here I've just focused on the differences by class. So how much do these things generalize? I've been really interested in knowing this for a very, very long time, and recently have been able to convince some great people in a lot of different countries to help me investigate these same trends in their microdata, either restricted census data or register data. So Charlie is here. He's going to go to the Canadian Research Data Center to try to dig out these statistics for one of our closest neighbors in the United States. We have Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Spain, United Kingdom. I am working on Austria and Sweden. If you know anyone, let me know. The goal is to both replicate these same types of statistics in these different countries, look at similarities. So what are the common features? One of the things we found that, in fact, this compression and variance seems to be universal in all of the countries we've also seen the same education gradients, though I will say measuring class is much more difficult over the longer term in a lot of other countries because they were much less educated at the beginning of the 20th century. So you have like 90% of the population with under 4 years of education. You just don't have a distribution, right, to work with in the same way. So that actually might be one of the most challenging parts of this project. You also see a lot of other changes. The one thing that does seem to differ a lot across place is sort of non-marital fertility and whether or not it's positively or negatively correlated with socioeconomic status. Okay. I've got 10 minutes. Okay, go ahead.
So maybe you're going there, but you started with the declining the TFR, and then you have all these things that show there's kind of a delay. So how much can you explain with just the delay? So
You queued me up, and that's where I'm going. So that's where we're going. So I was going to just talk for a minute about, I think there's a variety of things that are working to cause many of these shifts. I don't think we have a monocausal explanation. We have a lot of long moving processes. I've spent a lot of time, you've got sort of centuries of advocacy, the rise of second wave feminism turns out, I think is probably pretty important, but maybe not unrelated. to a variety of other things. You've got a lot of changes in marriage, sort of no-fault divorce. You've got diminished labor market opportunities. We think stagnating pay for a lot of less skilled men, which we think would have pushed women into labor markets and could have also generated some of these changes. Increase in the demand for and falling discrimination against women workers. And then another one that I have spent a lot of time looking at is the sort of technology of modern contraception and abortion, and more recently, the introduction of ART, which is going to change some of those fertility outcomes for some of the most educated women. Now, in the interest of time, there's a lot of quasi-experimental evidence, both for the US and other countries, that I will omit. I'm not going to have time to talk about that. But one of the cases I've made is like, why should this matter at all in terms of outcomes? So let me lay out that case briefly. Sort of one, a lot of people think immediately about the reliability of modern contraception. That strikes me as maybe the weakest thing that you could say about this. We know that people hit very low averages early in the 20th century without reliable contraception. But the more important piece is that this reduction in uncertainty around what your outcome will be conditional on making a particular choice about method or partner. And the fact that you have a lot more certainty means that it really mitigates the need for this marriage insurance, something that you would have needed to have before. There's also a big reduction in the behavioral costs of having fewer children. Reliable contraception in the past meant you had to take a specific action at the time of intimacy, either not having sex or a variety of other things to try to mitigate the risk of pregnancy. You can think about this as a very high marginal cost strategy. In the more recent period, we have a almost zero marginal cost associated with things like birth control pills, IUDs, and implants, right? And so high fixed cost, low marginal cost. So the name of the game today is more about sort of access, financial access to some of those methods. And finally, we think a lot in behavioral economics about the default. What is the default? Historically, you have sex, you get pregnant. Today, people, I think very interesting, talk about trying to get pregnant, right? Because the default has shifted from this not being something that just happens to everyone, but in fact, something that you have to work to do, especially if you've been on long-term hormonal contraception. So again, this is a real shift in the default. And so all of this is consistent with sort of planning career and family. So there's a lot of evidence on this I'm not going to talk about, but let's get to the last question. How far below replacement fertility is the US? This is hard to measure. Okay, at least my slides don't look completely terrible here, but I'm plotting out the the total fertility rate and also this completed rate of childbearing. And one of the things you can look at is right here, the cohorts right around 1975, this is my cohort, 1974, are right around 2. And since then, we've seen completed childbearing drop slightly. We're roughly at about 1.9 for the most recent cohort that we can measure. So that's slightly below. But remember this TFR, that 1.6, is the sum of all these age-specific rates. So let's take a closer look at those. These are the age-specific rates as we move through time for these are 20 to 24-year-olds. These are 15 to 19-year-olds. You can't see the difference on the slide. And these are women in their late 20s and sort of in the green. And since the Great Reset, well, I guess a couple of things. One, for teens and women in their early 20s, we've seen declining fertility rates since roughly 2000. They've been going down. There's a slight interruption here, but pretty much going down. One of the things that's changed since the Great Recession is we've seen declines for women in their late 20s, which has meant that a lot of these groups aren't making up childbearing later on, and this caused a lot of concern about whether or not we're going to actually hit 2. So what's going on with age-specific fertility rates for these other groups? So you can see right here, if you're looking at 30 to 34-year-olds, you can see that the rate has gone up. But since the Great Recession, instead of continuing to increase, we've seen those stagnate, though we've seen continued rise for women in their late 30s. And finally, if you look for older women, that is women in their early 40s, we've seen those rates continue to rise, though I will say even before the age of assisted reproductive technology, they were much higher during the baby boom, say, than they are now. So I think that we still have a ways we could go if we need to. And we've seen some small rises for women in their late 50s, but they're a very, very small share overall. Now, if you want to, oh my gosh, if you want to look to how this translates into a cumulative distribution function, how we're doing by age, and I'm going to tell you what's on this slide. One of the things you can see for cohorts born in 1960, 60 to 69, all the way up through the 1980s we were looking at, is you can see that there's some variation in where they start, like 72% versus 68% entering their 30s with at least one child. In fact, by the time we get over here, they've almost converged completely. So we don't see differential shifts into motherhood for the younger cohorts. For some of the ones that we cannot see all the way through to their late 30s, this is the cohort born from 80 to 85. One of the things you see, so this is like the end of the 80s, so they're not quite done. You can't observe them at age 40, for example. They start the decade, and this is a result of the decline, much lower, but they're converging very, very fast to sort of motherhood. So this means that it doesn't look like we have differential selection into motherhood. And for some of the most recent cohorts, again, they're starting their 30s with many fewer children, but they also appear to be catching up pretty quickly. So I think this bodes well that people are not opting out of childhood entirely. But if you want to just look, this is a slide that you can read. If you want to look at what's happened in terms of changes in completed childbearing, the name of the game here is really in terms of shifts from 2 to 3. So let me show you what I mean. The share with at least one child or more has increased since the beginning of the 20th century. We've seen the share with 2 has also increased, but the share with 3 since the end of the baby boom has really plummeted. And so this seems to be the big divide here, where if we're thinking about how we might change the future of fertility rates going forward, it's along this margin, not along shifts into motherhood. And that, for me, this has nothing to do with the timing of first birth. This is not about the TFR following or not. This is really much about whether people are choosing to continue with their families. Okay. So a couple of things to sum up. And I did finish on time. The TFR of 1.6 makes people think that we are not having a lot of children and that, things are going to continue to decline. I think that this number is misleading because it's conflating both changes in timing that seem to be happening right now with changes in completion. Now, that doesn't mean if you're thinking about other types of things that rely on the size of a cohort, this can still be very important, right? But I'm saying that it doesn't look like we are going to be shrinking a population at least as fast as would be implied by 1.6 TFR. So the US cohort completed fertility has stayed around 1.9 for quite some time now, and I believe that it will continue to stay here. At least we haven't seen any evidence from these other things that it's changing pretty dramatically. Things seem very stable. So I would guess, like, going forward, I'm going to go with like 1.9. If you push me, maybe like 1.85, but I think that's pretty much where we're going to stay. The challenges ahead, I think, are going to so if we want to raise childbearing, I think there's been a lot of discussion about this, but I think the demography here links this very nicely to public policy, thinking about the things that either encourage or inhibit the ability to move between 2 and 3, I think are going to be really crucial here. So I'll stop there. Thank you.